Well, we'll see how long it goes.
Yeah.
All right, we're live, Alexander. Can everyone hear me out there? If you can hear me, let me know in the chat. Let's see if you guys can hear me, if you guys can see me, let me know. Just give me a shout out. Great, yes. Bitcoin, thank you. Thank you, Romeo. Thank you, Scouts Jack. Thank you, Sadaya. Thank you, Valley, for that super chat. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Beth. Guys, we really apologize. We had, thank you, Nigel. Oh, yeah. We had one stream that we had set up and announced to go live, and Alexander got blocked from it. Then Peter got blocked. We had to delete that stream. We now did another stream. Peter got blocked from this stream. Alexander got through, but Peter tried 3, 4, 5 times, and we could see him, but he couldn't hear us. Alexander couldn't hear him. And anyway, he's got movers coming to his house in a couple of minutes anyway to go to his new apartment. So he's like, you guys just go on, the two of you. And he'll join us hopefully Monday. And we really apologize, guys. It's, Hangouts has been giving us a problem, Alexander, for how long now?
Absolutely. Oh, several months, I'd say, at least since the new year. It used to be working quite well.
It was great when we started, wasn't it?
Started, yeah, absolutely. And now it's got really creaky for some reason, and it's been a real bother. And we do apologise to our viewers, but it's a technical thing. We've all been ready, all three of us. Since for the last 50 minutes, and as I said, we've been bogged down trying to get through these technical problems.
And the worst part is that you can't really do much about it.
No,
you're messing around with your inputs. Alexander tried on his computer, then he tried on his phone. It kept on blocking him there.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're trying on multiple devices, and nothing comes through anyway. Once again. We really, really feel bad, guys, that we kept you all waiting.
Yeah.
We really feel bad. But, me and Alexander will do this one.
Absolutely.
Us too, and really appreciate everybody that is joining us and that did stick around to hear this live chat, this Friday live chat. What can you say, Alexander? You need competition.
Well,
if you don't have competition, this issue will never.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about the problems with the tech giants before, and there has to be competition. If there's competition, then they become motivated to sort out their problems. But otherwise, if everybody has to come to them, then, as I said, things will stagnate, much as they're doing at the moment. And if I can just throw in a geopolitical stroke economic point, putting up protectionist barriers to stop competition isn't going to help you deal with that problem. The problems that are arising with all of these technologies, which were pioneered in the United States, now are in the United States, because, as I said, it has allowed itself to drift into a position of monopolization. And that, as anybody who has studied market economics will tell you, is a recipe for problems of the sort that we've just experienced.
Yeah. Happy Cat, we just started right now. Actually, we had a good 50 minutes of issues. So we're just starting this chat right now. 50 minutes late, but better late than never.
We wouldn't miss you. We're certainly here.
even if we had to communicate with you guys via post, we do
via post. We do it exactly.
All right, so let's get
the old-fashioned way.
The old-fashioned. Pretty soon, it just may have to come to that.
Yes.
Jörg, Peter. Peter was going to be on the chat for an hour, and then he was going to get moving to his new apartment. And as time ran out, he's just like, "Look, the movers are coming in 10, 15 minutes, so." Guys, just go on without me, and he'll join us for the Monday chat. Yeah. And we may have to do the Monday chat on Zoom or something. We'll figure it out. We're trying to find ways to get around Hangouts, because Hangouts obviously doesn't want us. No. So we'll figure out a workaround. Alexander, let's get rolling then.
Indeed.
Let's just go straight to a question from Michael, Julian, Alexander. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
Guys, thank you for joining us. Everyone that is tuning in, thank you for sticking with us. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Another issue is that they're unsubscribing everyone that is subscribed. So make sure you're still subscribed. Double check it because they're unsubscribing people as well.
Yeah.
And that's also a problem. So we're fighting a lot of issues here, but we'll keep rolling.
Battling through. We're battling through, but we need your help. We need your help.
Yeah. So Michael, Julian, Alexander, let's get rolling to the Oracle of London, joining us from London. By the way, Alexander, how are you?
I'm very well. A lovely day. Walk the dogs. I'm going to be walking them again soon. Watched a very interesting film on Chelsea Manning yesterday to a largely empty cinema because it's not had much publicity and the reviews have been awful, but undeservedly awful, I would say. But you know, all is well here, and I'm very happy to be on our program at last.
Right. Alexander, let's talk tariffs. Got a lot of tariffs, and this question's from Michael. When is Russia going to ban the sale of titanium to the U.S. military industry across the board, starting with Boeing?
Well, we shall see. At the moment, the Russians are not doing these things. I think they're slowly edging, and not just the Russians, of course, but the Chinese. They're now talking about banning the export of rare earths. I think that the Russians had made a strategic decision about 15 years ago to integrate their economy with the world economy. They had developed all kinds of very close relationships with the European states, with Germany especially, which is a major investor in the Russian economy. The Russians were building the various gas pipelines to Germany. And of course, they also had a long-range objective of establishing close economic and commercial and political relations with the United States. That was perhaps more 20 years ago than 15 years ago. And we saw that the Russians were not just exporting titanium, but they were also cooperating with the US on the space programs, providing rocket launchers and all those sort of things. Now we've had decisions from the US that the US is not going to work with the Russians on space technology. I think the Russians are taking a line at the moment that they will not rise to US provocations of this kind. I mean, for one thing, they know that the United States can source its titanium elsewhere if it has to, though obviously at a higher price and at a greater cost. So I think they will do it in a measured way. But whereas even when we started doing our programs on YouTube for the Duran a year or so ago, I thought it unlikely that the Russians would go down the route of export bans. I think the way the world is evolving and the way the US is driving things, eventually, and we may get there. I don't think the Russians will do that soon, but you know, give it a few more months, perhaps, at the rate things are going, or even a year or two, and we may be talking a different story.
All right. Okay. Hello, Bill. Good to have you here. Sebastian. Hello. Jorg Valies. Hello, Valley. How are you? Simon Coates. How you doing? From Licardo, super chat. Alexander, what is the genesis of Bolton's hatred of Iran?
That's a very, very good question, actually. I mean, I think there are lots of factors. I mean, one of them, I am sure, is, of course, that Iran is the great geopolitical adversary, at least in Bolton's mind, of Israel. I mean, the Israelis, Israel being, you know, the US's great ally in the Middle East, and exercising great influence on American politics and great influence on the neocon community in the United States, of which Bolton is a member of. So I think there is that. I think in Bolton's case, as in a lot of the minds of many other Americans, actually, I think Bolton has never fully got over the events of 1979, 1980, where there was a revolution in Iran, which overthrew the former Shah of Iran. And over the course of that revolution, which very rapidly developed an anti-American dimension, the US embassy in Tehran was stormed, and the diplomatic personnel in that embassy were taken hostage, and they were held for many months in Iran, and in circumstances which many people found deeply humiliating. Many people in the United States found deeply humiliating. And I get the sense that John Bolton was one of those people. He clearly remembers it very vividly. And I think that has probably crystallized and hardened an antipathy towards Iran on his part, which is shared by several other people and which would probably exist anyway for the geopolitical reasons that I discussed. The fact that Iran is this great power that is against Israel and which pursues an independent foreign policy in the Middle East.
Okay, Jeff from Wales looking in. Hello, Jeff. Jonathan from Wales looking in. All right. Hello, Jonathan. Hello, Gloria. Let's see, Alexander from Keith Durant. I hear Malaysia is not happy with the politics of MH17 investigation, especially since they can't have the black box from their plane. We have not heard anything about MH17 for a long, long time, Alexander.
Well, indeed. Can I just say, I mean, what our viewer, Mr. Duran, is referring to are certain comments by the very strong-minded and independent-minded Malaysian Prime Minister, Mr. Mahathir Mohamad, who has recently returned to power in Malaysia after an unexpected victory in the Malaysian elections, general elections, which took place last year, and which replaced what had previously been a very, very strongly pro-American government, which was perceived by many people in Malaysia to be very corrupt. Now, Mr. Mahathir has a colorful and strong history. He's widely seen in Malaysia as the father of the country, and he has clearly been very dissatisfied with the entire course of the MH17 investigation. Now, can I just explain? This investigation is one that was set up by Ukraine, the Netherlands, and Malaysia. Ukraine being the country where the accident happened, the Netherlands being the country from where most of the passengers of MH17 came from, and Malaysia being the country of whose airline MH17 belonged. So these three countries set up this investigation without consulting or informing the Security Council, and of course they excluded the Russians from that entire investigation, and Ukraine is a key player in that investigation, even though there is a widespread belief shared by many people that Ukraine has many serious questions to answer about that investigation and may in fact itself have been responsible for the shooting down of MH17. I'm not saying it was, but lots of people think it was, and there are grounds to think it was. So already that was an unsatisfactory investigation. In practice, and if you follow the course of the investigation very closely, it's quite clear that it's been run by the Ukrainians and the Dutch, and the Malaysians, who were never fully trusted, have been pushed aside. And since Mr. Mahathir came to power, they've been entirely pushed aside. And Mr. Mahathir is very, very unhappy about this and has now made comments about the fact that though Malaysia is part of this investigation, it is not being shown any of the evidence, and it has seen no evidence that Russia was responsible for shooting down MH17. Now, this has happened, as our viewer correctly says, with no final report being issued. There was an interim report which blamed the militia groups in eastern Ukraine that are fighting the Ukrainian government, and which says that they were provided by this missile system, which allegedly shot down MH17, by the Russians. The Russians have provided very, very plausible and convincing evidence that that was not so. They provided radar data that suggested that it couldn't have been launched from where the Ukrainians and the Dutch say it was launched. They've also provided very compelling evidence based on information the Dutch and the Ukrainians have themselves provided from the serial numbers of the missile that shot down MH17, that it was in fact supplied to a military unit, a Soviet military unit based in Ukraine in 1986, before the Soviet Union broke up, and that it has never in fact been a part of the Russian military. And therefore, that points to the fact that the Ukrainian military was possibly responsible. Now, what I think Mr. Mahathir is saying is that the investigation is a mess, that it is not independent, that it has not looked at all the evidence, that it has not been conducted in a transparent way. And I predict that before very long, Malaysia will dissociate itself entirely from this investigation, which, as our viewer correctly says, has never provided a complete conclusion and has gone silent over the next couple of months. Now, I'm going to say something else. I think this is a story we need to follow very closely. There's been a change of government in Ukraine. A lot of the personnel that belonged to the previous government in Ukraine have been sacked. There's apparently lots of unhappy people who are prepared to come forward in Ukraine and provide information about things they know. And I would not be surprised if we, before very long, find out that things that people know or should have known about MH17 and which have been suppressed now start to trickle out and become known, because people start to come forward. And I wonder whether Mr. Mahathir, who is a man with his ear very closely to the ground, is picking up on this. So this is a story we shall keep an eye on and we should follow. And our viewer is very, very acute and shrewd to have pointed out this statement, which the media in the West have, by Mr. Mahathir, which the media in the West has entirely ignored.
All right, Alexander, what do you think from Steve? What do you think about the death of democracy in the UK?
Well, I think we have done massive programs about this, and we've even issued an ebook on the subject, which has a foreword from me, in which I pointed out that if a referendum was held, as it was in 2016, in which a clear majority of the people who voted to leave the EU, and if that decision is not implemented, was not implemented, I said that there would be a political crisis with a movement rising up in England that would challenge the establishment even further, and which would trigger a major political crisis in Britain. And all of that is coming to pass, and it's coming to pass in the most disastrous way. I mean, we had a very simple way forward in 2016, which is to implement the decision of the referendum, which was to carry out Brexit. That has not happened, and as a result, people are asking the kind of questions about the future of democracy in Britain that our viewer is asking, and we have a major political crisis here, and we have a country that has become deeply divided on that very issue which the referendum was called to settle. Is Britain still a democracy? It is a country where a lot of people still believe in democracy and are prepared to fight for it, and I am one of those people.
Alexander, the Bilderberg conference is actually going on. This is from Jay Van Hogen. Greetings from the Netherlands. I have heard that Kushner will be visiting the Bilderberg conference this weekend. Any thoughts on that? Stacey Adams is also going to it. And who else? I think some other Democrat presidential nominees are also candidates, are also going to the Bilderberg. What do you make of the Bilderberg?
Well, I think, there's a lot of views about the Bilderberg, that it's some sort of vast, rather select sort of, how shall I say, directorate that rules the world. I think it's just a talking shop, a very powerful and very rich people who come together.
Could you say they collude?
Well, they do collude to some extent, and of course they collude even more in places like Davos. But I think we should be careful about assuming that these people really do rule the world. First of all, the world is too big to be ruled by them. I mean, powers like China and Russia are now emerging, which clearly are not part of this sort of complex. And even within the West, there are mounting challenges to the sort of centrist globalist policies with which groups like the Bilderbergers are associated. I think what one can say about the Bilderberg group is that it is part of this sort of web of organizations, institutions. As I say, Davos is perhaps the most notorious, which come together where these people meet and talk to each other and agree stage things, but I doubt that any really important decisions are made there. And I'm afraid that Kushner is going there doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I mean, it's exactly the sort of place where I would expect a person like that to fit in very well.
From Susan Alexander, the North Korea executions. This was an interesting story.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, what do you make of those? Is
well, first
true
of
or
all,
not true?
Well, that's the first question. I mean, I think I should say that this story originates in the South Korean media, and parts of the South Korean media have written very sensationalist stories about North Korea, and have reported executions and people being executed, which have not happened. I mean, there was one particular instance where a very prominent North Korean general was reported as having been executed, only for him to resurface a short while later in a completely different post. So I would treat this story with a certain skepticism, and I don't really understand the logic of it, because it would suggest that Kim Jong-un is somehow very angry with people who led him into this meeting with Donald Trump in Hanoi and is blaming them for its failure, whereas the North Korean media has made it very, very clear that they are actually blaming the United States for the failure of that summit. If it is true, if these reports really are true, then it is a very ominous sign indeed, because it would suggest that this policy of trying to achieve some kind of reconciliation with the United States has been controversial within North Korea and within the North Korean leadership, and that the failure of the Hanoi summit has led to recriminations and criticism by the hardliners within the North Korean government, and the people who were supporting a reconciliation with the United States, and we're talking about a process of denuclearization which would lead to North Korea opening up to the world, that those people have lost and have paid for it with their lives. If that is the case, then we're going to see a harder stand from North Korea, and a further probable return to the nuclear weapons and missile programs that are the root of this crisis.
All right, let's get to some super chats. From Val V. Palad from Cape Cod, keep buggering on. All right, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, thank you for that super chat. From Blair Gubernath, love the channel, just purchased a mug and t-shirt. Thank you, Blair, very much for supporting us and buying that mug and t-shirt. That's right. And from Joe Public, bought a mug earlier. Hope the motif is gold plated for that price.
Oh yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much. But thank you for your support, Joe, in all honesty. Thank you. It really helps us out. And Alexander from Penguins fan, and I was going to get to this topic, and it's breaking news, actually, that the negotiations, the ceasefire negotiations between Turkey and Russia seem to have broken down. At least that's the news that's coming in, and that Russian jets have now started targeting Idlib, Russian and Syrian jets.
Yes.
So the super chat from Penguins fan is an update on Idlib and Syria.
Yeah.
And there's another super chat from Penguins fan Alexander, which is along the same lines, which is the U.S. accusing Syria of chemical attacks again, after we know the last one was staged. What's going on? So we wanted to get it to Syria, actually, and cover that today. What's going on, Alexander? One with Idlib, and number two with more, I would like to say, bogus chemical weapons attacks, because we've seen this saga dance play out now. This, I think, is the fourth time that we're seeing this accusation getting thrown around. Alexander, Syria.
Yes, well, first of all, I mean, the news today is a very heavy bombing of militant positions in Idlib by the Russian Air Force. Apparently, Russian aircraft are now in full operation in Idlib province, over Idlib, and they've been, as I said, hammering away at the militants, at the jihadis there, and this came shortly after a Al-Qaeda-led offensive against Syrian government positions in northern Hama, and to some extent against Aleppo, which is in a different part of Syria, which, however, was repulsed, with the Syrian military going back on the counteroffensive and recovering all the territory that was captured briefly by the jihadis during this rebel offensive. And apparently they have actually pushed the jihadis further back towards Idlib province. I should say, when we talk about Idlib, most of Idlib is jihadi controlled, not all of it. But this enclave also extends into another province, which is Hama, northern Hama province, which has been partly controlled by the jihadis. Anyway, that apparently, that control of the jihadis in that area is weakening. Now, as Alex correctly said, there have been negotiations between the Russians and the Turks over a ceasefire. Those negotiations have broken down. The point about the ceasefire is it was not supposed to be, as I understand it, an across-the-board ceasefire. It was rather a ceasefire that was intended to divide most of the people in Idlib from the Al-Qaeda-aligned jihadi fighters there. Turkey has found it impossible, or has been very unwilling to separate those fighters, those jihadi fighters, from the rest, just as the United States incidentally once was. And there have also been reports that they provided some of those fighters over the last few days with fresh weapons. So the Russians have retaliated hard, and they're hitting these fighters very hard with their air force. But apparently, they're still restraining the Syrian military from launching an offensive, an actual ground offensive to clear southern Idlib. So I suspect that the Russians are now ratcheting up the pressure on the Turks, on President Erdogan, and they're saying to them, you know, you're not succeeding in what you said you would do, which is to both impose an enforceable ceasefire and to separate these jihadis. We will hammer them. The Syrian army will hammer them. If you want to prevent that happening and have an exodus of these people into Turkey, then you must act now to deliver on your previous promises. And we will see what the Turks do. But one way or the other, and I come back to what I said, I think we are moving very quickly now towards the end game in Idlib. And I suspect that we will see Syrian military units moving further into Idlib province, with a tacit agreement between the Russians and the Turks that the Turks will pull out of Idlib and will focus instead on extending their control in northern Syria at the expense of the Kurds. So that's what I think is going to happen. Now, as to these warnings about chemical attacks, this is a bizarre and very, very strange story, because where I think it began was with the publication in Britain of this suppressed report by the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, of the suppressed engineering report, which basically says that the previous chemical attack, the chlorine chemical attack in Douma, was staged. Now, Western governments and the Western media have been completely silent about that report. They've acted as if they didn't exist. But the US published, the State Department published about 2 weeks ago, this extraordinary, furious statement saying that the Syrians had carried out another chemical attack, a chlorine attack in Idlib, and criticizing the Russians for smearing the OPCW and the White Helmets. Now, I thought that looked to me very much like an attempt to reaffirm US support for the OPCW and for the White Helmets in the face of the publication of this suppressed OPCW report, which strongly suggests, in fact almost confirms, that the previous chemical attack in Douma was staged. And I think what the US is now trying to do is that it's ramping up this story, partly again in order to protect the OPCW and the White Helmets, but also possibly in order to warn the Russians and the Syrians off a further offensive in Idlib. On the second, I am pretty sure that the Russians will ignore these warnings.
Alexander, a question from Happy Cat. Will the U.S. have a real civil war if President Trump is impeached and removed from office? One of the big stories, Alexander, of course, was the Mueller statement, where Mueller kind of gave us an 8-minute lecture on why he is the chosen one, why he did this investigation, and of course why he's not going to testify to anybody. He has done. He feels that he has said everything he has to say, but he dropped a hint to the Democrats, to the deep state, to the DNC. Please proceed with impeaching Donald Trump. Alexander, what do you make of Mueller's statement? We did a couple of videos on this. And do you think that if they actually move ahead with impeaching Trump, which will not be successful, obviously, because the Senate won't allow it, but either way, is there a risk of some sort of civil war in the U.S.?
Right. I think what's more likely to happen is a civil war within the Democrat Party, actually. On the subject of Mueller's statement, we did a video on this. He spoke for 8 minutes in this extraordinary, strangled, tortuous, evasive, overcomplicated language he uses, in which he pretends to be clear and straightforward, you know, a straight shooter. And it's nothing of the sort. As I said, it took us over 30 minutes to unpack what he said in 8 minutes. I mean, it was a bizarre statement. Let me repeat again, and it's a point that the Attorney General, William Barr, has since made. If Mueller thought that Donald Trump had committed a crime by obstructing justice, there is absolutely nothing in any regulation which says that he's not at liberty to say so. He doesn't have to issue an indictment. He could have very straightforwardly said in his report, I believe Donald Trump obstructed justice for X, Y, Z reasons, and now it's up to Congress to decide what they should do about it, whether they should impeach him or not. He didn't do that. He instead retreated into these bizarre double negatives of saying, you know, we did not conclude that the president did not obstruct justice, which some people fallaciously are taking as a finding that Donald Trump did obstruct justice. And, you know, it's twisted language. But as Alex has correctly said, it's clearly intended to encourage the Democrats to start impeachment proceedings. I don't think it will result in a civil war in the United States. I don't think these impeachment proceedings will work. I think what it will do is create a massive electoral backlash against the Democrat Party if they go down this foolish road. And I think that people like Schumer and Pelosi understand this very well, because they understand that there is not a case for impeachment there. I mean, there just isn't. Having said that, whilst I don't see any prospect of a civil war in the United States anytime soon, it is a fact that the United States, like Britain also, by the way, is becoming increasingly polarized in a way which over time will start to make it increasingly unstable. We're starting to see that in Britain. We're seeing that also in the United States. When there is instability, there is political crisis. When there is political crisis, things start to go wrong. Civil war, I absolutely hope not. I don't believe it will happen. I don't see that as any kind of solution. I abhor violence, and I think it would be a terrible thing. I don't believe it will happen. I don't see it. But if you want to destabilize your own country, then people like Mueller and some of the people in the Democrat Party who've been calling for impeachment, are going about it in the right way.
Alexander, 2 points on the Mueller statement, which I would like your comments on. Basically, Mueller said, and I've even written this down because it is such a confusing statement.
Yeah.
He said that he was going, in order to impeach Trump.
Yes.
He's not going to impeach Trump, sorry, because you cannot prove Trump did not commit a crime. So let me say again, he could not prove that Trump did not commit a crime.
Yeah,
so Alexander, I cannot prove that you did not commit a crime.
Yes. Yeah, well,
that's his blanket statement. You need to throw everyone in prison.
Well, exactly. I mean,
because we can't prove that they did not commit a crime. And the other point that I would like you to comment on, Alex, that statement in and of itself is beyond ridiculous. And it turns the entire U.S. justice system on its head, obviously.
Which is based on the presumption of innocence, let us remember.
Well, Mueller is basing everything on the presumption of guilt.
Well, indeed.
In that case, Hillary Clinton really does need to be locked up.
Absolutely.
Because we can't prove that she didn't commit a crime.
Yes.
As does, half of Washington, D.C., for that matter.
Yes.
But Aaron Mate was on Tucker Carlson.
I watched it.
And you watched it. I'm a big fan of Aaron Mate. I like what he does. But when they brought up what Mueller's accusations on the Russians and the GRU officers, there was a little hesitation from Mate. There was a little hesitation from Tucker in that they couldn't understand who Mueller's source was for the 12 Russian GRU supposedly hackers of the Clinton emails.
Yes.
His source, and Mate did mention that his source was not the NSA, obviously. If it was the NSA, we would have known about it. So who's Mueller's source? Everyone's kind of sitting there scratching their heads. Alexander, Mueller's source was Christopher Steele, was it not?
Well, this is my view, right? Let's start.
It was Christopher Steele. That's the source. Go on, Alexander.
Let's start with the first part of your question about this absurd idea that he couldn't say that the president did not commit a crime. As you absolutely rightly say, that can be said about that can be said about
everyone, everyone in this chat, you, me, everybody.
Yes. I mean, we have never proceeded on that basis. I mean, let me repeat again. There is absolutely nothing to prevent Mueller, not in any guideline by the Office of Legal Counsel, not in any guideline of the Justice Department. Nowhere does it say that as special counsel carrying out the kind of investigation that he carried out, he is not able to take a view. He's fully entitled to take a view and to come out and say, in my opinion, Donald Trump is guilty of obstruction. Attorney General Barr expected him to come to a view. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein expected him to come to a view. They were both astonished when he didn't. And he's never provided any kind of explanation of why he didn't come to a view. What is the point of appointing special counsel, of having a vast investigation, spending $40 million on that investigation, if at the end of that investigation, the special counsel comes along and says, well, it's not for me to say whether or not I think a crime was committed or not. I mean, that's absolute nonsense. What it looks to me is as if Mueller knows he doesn't have a very strong case against Trump on obstruction. That's putting it mildly, but wants to give the impression that he does. So he's coming up with this bizarre, contorted choice of words, falling, stepping back from saying, I think he committed obstruction, but at the same time giving the impression that he thinks that Donald Trump committed obstruction. And I have to say, I think that's incredibly dishonorable and extremely wrong. And I think that it explains why Mueller is not prepared to go before Congress to answer questions, because I think he knows perfectly well that if he does, the Republicans in the committees, in the House and in the Senate, will simply tear him to pieces if he comes before them with that kind of ridiculous argument. Now, let's now deal with the non-existent evidence, because as Aaron Mate absolutely rightly said, no actual evidence has been provided by Mueller that the Russians hacked the DNC. What he has provided is this extremely detailed, very circumstantial indictment of these 12 alleged GRU officers, in which he says that they carried this out, but he doesn't provide any of the supporting evidence. And of course, all that part of the report where that evidence is laid out, which is not very long, by the way, is redacted. And of course, they will say it's redacted because it's not just classified, but because the indictment has been approved by a grand jury. It is redacted because it falls under the grand jury remit of secrecy. Now, Aaron Mate said in that interview with Tucker Carlson that Roger Stone's attorneys in the case which has been brought against him are claiming that the evidence of that indictment came from CrowdStrike. Now, CrowdStrike provided the claim, the original claim, that the DNC computers were hacked. As we all know, the FBI itself did not examine those computers. It relied upon CrowdStrike to provide the evidence, even though that's a bizarre approach, that there was any kind of hacking at all. Now, as to the attribution of that hacking to the Russians, certainly CrowdStrike did it. But the other piece of evidence, as has become increasingly clear now, is Christopher Steele's dossier. Because what we know about the dossier, what we actually know is that in August 2016, the CIA reported that they had human intelligence, that Vladimir Putin had ordered a campaign to tilt the election in Donald Trump's favor, and this included a specific instruction to hack the DNC computers. And as I pointed out when we first learned about that information, and I pointed that out in June 2017, that almost certainly, that human intelligence almost certainly was Christopher Steele's dossier. And we've now had an article by the New York Times, which if you scan that article carefully, which Andrew McCarthy for National Review has done, confirms the same thing. If you scan it carefully, it shows that this source in the Kremlin who provided that information was not in direct contact with the CIA. He provided, or allegedly provided, his information to an informer who passed it on through various routes to the CIA. Now, that describes exactly the scenario in the Steele dossier. We have an alleged source who may or may not exist, an informant who clearly does, who is Christopher Steele, and that seems to be the human evidence. Now, the important point is that it seems that it was that information which caused first the CIA and then the FBI to link the two pieces of evidence they were getting together, the report from CrowdStrike and the report from Steele, and conclude that the hacking was done by the Russians, and it was the Russians who provided the evidence to WikiLeaks. Now, I'm just going to quickly, before I finish, this has been a long piece, I'm sorry for that, but I'm just going to finish by returning to things that Aaron Mate said. Aaron Mate made to Tucker Carlson. Aaron Mate made two very important points. He made the point that Mueller does not actually know it was the Russians who hacked the DNC computers. He says in the report that it appears it was the Russians. So he introduces that element of doubt, and that has to be because of the way in which the Steele dossier has now been discredited. And of course, the other side of it is that he also points out something I picked up immediately, which is that Mueller does not say that it was the Russians who provided the emails, the stolen emails to WikiLeaks. He only suggests that it was. He can't provide any link that clearly shows the Russians handing over these emails to WikiLeaks. He has to create a scenario using this entity Guccifer 2 as a sort of cutout or bridge, even though he admits himself that WikiLeaks may have got these emails from a courier, a former reporter in the United States, who is known to have come to Britain and to have provided information which may have been those emails at about that time.
Yeah, that is why Aaron Mate had to mention that Mueller put those qualifiers like appear in the report. And
Absolutely.
Tucker Carlson was actually surprised to find that out. He seemed like he was genuinely surprised to learn that Mueller actually put those qualifiers in front, which signifies that Mueller has no idea how that stuff got to where it needed to be.
Exactly. Now, can I just make a point about Mueller? I mean, I've just pointed out how misleading and evasive his statement, the statement that he just put out was. The same is true of his report. I mean, the report is very cunningly written to give the impression of all sorts of bad things going on, and to insinuate some kind of conspiracy without actually saying so, which is exactly what his statement the other day did. It's really deplorable, actually. And if you want to see another example of this, go to another person who's picked up on this. Go to Byron York's latest article on the Washington Examiner, where he makes exactly the same point, that all kinds of innocuous meetings, which actually mean nothing, between various Russians of various types, who, you know, may find themselves in contact with someone who has some peripheral connection to Donald Trump, may not even be part of Donald Trump's campaign. It is consistently written about as if there's something portentous and sinister going on. Well, actually, there's nothing going on. And you get this time and time again. The whole report is written to imply that there's something very strange and very bad happening, when nothing like that is happening at all. It's a real hatchet job. It's a very, very terrible misuse of words of a sort that, frankly, some lawyers are very skilled at.
Yeah, no one's to believe Mueller at all. I mean, the guy is sneaky. He's slippery. Let's not forget that he pushed the Iraq WMD lie.
Well, indeed.
He pushed that lie. People should not forget anything that Mueller did. The guy was FBI director. He lies through his teeth. He's a real scumbag, in my opinion. Alexander, it was real simple. and we're going to get to the big topic of the day. It was real simple. All Mueller had to do, if he really was this upstanding, moral character that the media portrayed him to be, which he is not, all he had to do to crack this entire case, this entire hoax, was look into the DNC server with CrowdStrike. Just look into that. No biggie. Get some techies on it. Go there. See that. Talk to Christopher Steele. Bring him to the US or go to the UK. Fly to the damn UK. Get your ass on a plane and go to the UK and talk to Christopher Steele. He wrote the Steele dossier that all of this is based on. The unmaskings, the FISAs, all of it. That's all he had to do. A $500 plane ticket, DC to London. You know where Steele is. By the way, you also know where Mifsud is. You know where Stefan Halper is. You know where all these guys are.
Exactly.
All of them. All of them. And the other thing that Mueller could have done, if he was really this upstanding guy, was while he's in London talking to Steele, all he had to do was go right on over to the Ecuador embassy. I'm sure you know where it is, Alexander. You know the street. You know where it's located.
I know very well.
There you go. Go to the Ecuador embassy and speak with the WikiLeaks founder, the co-founder, Julian Assange, and end this charade once and for all. And you will find out exactly what was going on between Trump, Russia, the DNC, the hackings, all that stuff, the WikiLeaks releases, everything. That's all he had to do. He could have cut a deal with Julian Assange. Julian Assange could have walked out of the embassy, a free man. And if the U.S. democracy was under such a big threat, because supposedly, Alexander, you have the president of the U.S. is a Russian puppet. I can't imagine anything more dangerous than that. So why not cut a deal with Julian Assange, end this entire hoax once and for all, Absolutely. And you restore democracy back to the United States. That's all he could have done. Now you have Julian Assange. From what we understand, he's gravely ill. UN doctor was there, and I believe a U.S. doctor or a UN lawyer was there.
UN lawyer was there.
UN lawyer
could barely make him understand what he was saying.
Could barely make him understand what was going on. The man has been suffering tremendously. Yeah. He's now in the medical ward of Belmarsh prison right now. He's being looked after. They say his physical health is okay, but they say his psychological health has deteriorated tremendously. Alexander, I said a lot. Take it.
Well,
over.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we're coming back to Mueller, and that's perhaps where we should focus this on at the moment. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, he conducted this investigation in an incredibly aggressive way, and in a completely bizarre way. I mean, instead of going after the obvious people who know the truth, Christopher Steele. By the way, he did apparently speak to Christopher Steele, but these were apparently very friendly.
Where was it in the Mueller report, Alexander?
Well, exactly,
where was it in the Mueller report?
It was. Well, not in the Mueller report, oddly enough, but apparently he did. We've subsequently learned he had two very friendly, voluntary chats with Christopher Steele, but nothing much about it in the Mueller report. But he didn't speak to Assange. He didn't examine the servers, and instead, he went after Paul Manafort. He went after Flynn. He went after Carter Page. He went after Roger Stone. He went after all these peripheral individuals who were not the people who were really, at the end of the day, at the heart of this story. And even then, it seems, and now there's growing evidence of this, he knew well before the end of 2017 that there had been no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And he continued with his investigation for over a year, allowing a cloud to remain over the President of the United States and over the US government, despite the fact that he apparently knew that the central allegation that was being made, that the President of the United States was the Siberian candidate leveraged into power as a result of a conspiracy between the Russians and Donald Trump and his campaign. He knew that whole conspiracy scenario was phony, and he let it continue. He let people think it was still live for more than a year. And instead, as we have seen, he spent the rest of that year dredging around with this absurd obstruction of justice argument, about which he himself, in the end, refused to come to a conclusion. Now, I mean, a more dishonest report than that, I can't think of. I mean, you know, it beggars belief that this has been taken seriously and that people continue to think of Robert Mueller as anything else than what he has clearly turned out to be, which is a deep state hatchet man and sidekick.
What do you make of what's going on with Julian Assange, Alexander?
Oh, I think this is terrible. I mean, first of all, if I may say so, the person who met him in Belmarsh and who found him in this terrible state was no mere UN official. He is the UN rapporteur on torture, and he has said that, as far as he's concerned, Julian Assange has been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and that, which is of course contrary to international law. And he's also, incidentally, severely criticized the proceedings that have been brought against Assange in Britain, the United States, and Sweden. And he has said that this is these three countries ganging up on him. And there's been an astonishing exchange of tweets between him and our Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, in which Jeremy Hunt said that Julian Assange was always free to leave the Ecuador embassy. And the UN rapporteur has come back and said, well, he was free to leave the Ecuadorian embassy in the same way that a man is free to jump out of a rubber dinghy into a lake of sharks. So that's what the UN rapporteur on torture thinks about this affair. And I'm going to say this, I mean, apparently Julian Assange is severely ill. I mean, at the very least, he should be released from Belmarsh prison. It's completely inappropriate that a man in such ill health should continue to be in detention in that way. I mean, there is no risk of him escaping anywhere. Where would he escape to? That sentence of 50 weeks in prison for skipping police bail was wildly disproportionate. I mean, it's unheard of. And frankly, it is not only unheard of, but it is wholly unjustified and is further evidence, to my mind, of the fact that he is being put through what, as I said, the UN rapporteur on torture calls cruel and unusual punishment. If Julian Assange becomes permanently injured as a result of all of this, or perish the thought, if he dies, then frankly, the people who will be responsible will be the British government first and foremost.
Alexander, is it normal to be removed from the embassy, when he was removed from the embassy, and to go stand in front of a judge within 6 hours? Didn't Julian Assange deserve at least a couple of days, even weeks, to prepare for that hearing and for that sentencing? I mean, is that a normal thing that happens in the UK?
No,
I mean,
it's not.
You know, Tommy also went through a similar thing where he was rushed right before a judge right away when they grabbed him outside of the prison when he was live streaming. So, I mean, this is becoming very common in the United Kingdom.
Well, it is. To answer your question, it's not very common at all. It's very rare, and it should be rare, because at the end of the day, a person should be entitled to give proper instructions to his lawyers after taking proper advice from
common sense,
lawyers.
Isn't it?
It's common sense, exactly. But as you absolutely rightly say, in Julian Assange's case, the case was rushed through, and he ended up being given almost the maximum sentence, which, as far as I know, has never been given in similar circumstances before. And the whole episode of the British police entering the Ecuadorian embassy and removing someone who had been granted political asylum in that embassy in that way, even if that was done with the permission and agreement of the Ecuadorian authorities was completely wrong. And we learn that not only was he arrested, but his private possessions left behind him in that embassy have been seized also, and have been misappropriated, and have been sent apparently off to the US for further examination. Now, I mean, all that is so shocking. It breaks so many rules. I really don't know where to start. And it comes on top of an endless succession of violations of procedure and due process in Julian Assange's case. If you want to get a flavor of how extensive they are, there's a good article by Jonathan Cook, who is a journalist who used to work for The Guardian, but who now has his own website, in which he sets out not all of these violations, because to do so would mean a whole book, but at least some of them, and explains how due process has basically been thrown out of the window in this case. And can I stress again, that's not just my opinion, it's also the opinion of the UN rapporteur on torture. And it was previously the opinion of a UN tribunal that by preventing him from going to Ecuador, the British government and the British authorities were violating his rights as a refugee, a political refugee who had been granted asylum.
Alexander, if something happens to Julian Assange, and things are looking very bleak, I think everyone is worried. And I think I'm reading the chat right now, and I think people in the chat are also worried. You mentioned the UK government will have blood on its hands.
Well, they'll be responsible.
Who else? Who else? Oh, responsible. You say it in a much more diplomatic tone.
Well, because I want to choose.
Alexander,
no, I want to choose. I want to choose my words very carefully. Right. And I tell you, and I mean, the reason I'm doing so, and I want to make this very clear, is because there is a legal process, and there may very well be a legal process if the worst happens. And I don't want to be at this point spoken of as somebody who's preempting that legal process. And given that I've spoken in public places on behalf of Julian Assange, I don't want to say anything which might have an effect on that process if it ever happens, which I hope it doesn't. So I want to make that very, very clear to our viewers.
Okay,
carry on, Alex.
Thank you for clarifying that, Alexander. Who else is responsible for Assange's fate as we see it right now? Can you say Donald Trump? Can you say the U.S. government? Can you say Australia? Can you say Sweden? Break it down for us, Alexander. Who should have done something? Right. Anybody had done something to remedy the situation.
Right. The country that is most at fault in this situation is Britain, because, as I said, he has been on British territory. It is the British who prevented him, contrary to international law, from going to Ecuador, exercising his rights as a political refugee to go to Ecuador. And it is the British who've put him through this extraordinary judicial process, which the UN rapporteur for torture is saying amounts to cruel and unusual punishment. The other country, which I have to say bears a great deal of the blame for this, is Ecuador, not perhaps the previous Ecuadorian government, which granted him asylum, but the current Ecuadorian government, which has failed to protect someone to whom Ecuador granted asylum. Now, other countries, Sweden, Australia, and the United States may be involved also. But before I say that they are involved, and again, I have to be careful what I say for the reason I said previously, before we can say exactly what their level of responsibility is, we need to know more about what they and the British and the Ecuadorians were doing with each other. We know that the Ecuadorians were working very closely with the United States and were coordinating with the United States, and this must have had some impact on the way that Assange was treated whilst he was still in the Ecuadorian embassy. And we also know about the way in which Sweden interacted with the British, and how the Swedes let themselves be persuaded by the British not to interview Assange in Britain on the Swedish rape allegations, as the Swedes were apparently prepared to do. So that already creates issues about the way the US and the Swedes have behaved. Now, as for Australia, we must not forget, of course, that Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, and the Australians have completely failed to act in order to protect him. So it seems to me that there is a high responsibility there also.
What do you think is going to happen, Alexander, if you had to place a guess, a hunch, looking at the situation right now?
Well, I don't want to make guesses where a man's life is concerned. I very, very much.
I'm talking about his case.
Well, okay, about his case. I'm sorry to say this, and as I said, I've spoken I've spoken in public places in Britain on behalf of Julian Assange, and you can find some of my comments on YouTube now, by the way, including on our website, where I know you reposted a public meeting, Alex, a video of a public meeting, which I attended. But I'm sorry to say this, given that there have been so many violations of due process in this case up to now, how can I have any confidence that that won't continue? In my opinion, he has a very strong legal case that he should not be extradited either to the United States or to Sweden. But I am far from confident that he won't be extradited to one or other of those countries. And I have to say that I think my guess is that he may eventually find himself in the United States, facing trial there. And can I say something else? That may in some ways, from a legal point of view, be the best situation for him. Because, sorry though I am to say this, I think there are more lawyers in the United States willing to defend a man who is being prosecuted under the Espionage Act in ways that go against the First Amendment of the Constitution than there are in Britain. And I would also say that I think the courts in the United States, including the Supreme Court of the United States, may be more open and more willing to respond to those arguments. But I can't pretend that I have huge optimism for the legal prospects of this case, even though I think on the facts and on the law, it is a very strong one.
I agree with you, Alexander. Actually, I think Assange's best course of action, oddly enough, ironically enough, is to make it to the US.
Yes.
Forget Sweden.
Forget Sweden.
Forget Sweden. Get to the US where you have good legal representation. And if you can get to the Supreme Court, then I think he has a chance. It has to go to the Supreme Court, though.
Absolutely.
Get to the Supreme Court. He may actually have a chance to beat this. Legally, I think you're right. It sounds to me that legally he has a very solid case, but it has to get to the Supreme Court. And here's the $1 million question that a lot of people are always asking when they're always talking about his extradition to the US is always, will Trump pardon him?
No. First of all, he won't be pardoned before he's convicted. There's no way Donald Trump is going to, in my opinion, short circuit this legal process. I think the political consequences for Donald Trump to do that in the run up to the 2020 election is just too great. And I just don't think Donald Trump will do that. After the 2020 election, the dynamic may change. I think his greatest chances of success are to take this case in the US all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, where there are brilliant jurists who care about the Constitution of the United States and who have a responsibility to protect it.
Is there any chance that Assange ends up in Guantanamo, or if the U.S. is the route?
No,
So
I
if
don't
he's
think
extradited to the U.S., it's definitely going to start moving through the legal system, correct?
I think so, no question at all. I mean, he's been indicted in the US, so I think he will be tried in the US, in the court in Virginia, before a judge who is known to be apparently very prosecution-minded and very, very sympathetic to the intelligence services. So I don't expect him to win in trial at first instance, but he does have a good chance, I think, of winning on appeal. And I think the Supreme Court of the United States is about the one court where they will understand his arguments and take them seriously. And as I understand it, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is able to tap into some brilliant lawyers, is prepared to work for his defense. So that may be the best course for him. But having said that, I mean, we should be under no illusions. If he ends up in the United States, he could face extremely severe conditions in detention up to the moment when he goes before the Supreme Court. And that would be a protracted case. So he could find himself in detention, very difficult detention, for at least a year and probably longer.
In the U.S., Alexander, can you make the argument that for a lawyer, it would be the trial of the century? So he would probably get the best legal representation there is in the United States. I mean, a lawyer, I imagine the best lawyers would want to take this case on, correct?
Well, I would hope so. I would hope so. And the United States has some brilliant lawyers. I mean, has lots of brilliant lawyers. But this case needs an outstanding one. Now, there are outstanding lawyers in the US. And I think, I mean, Dershowitz, as I know previously, worked to help Assange, even though they probably disagree on politics on many things. But I can see lots of other people doing it. And I would have thought this would be a hugely important case. And but what it needs is someone with tremendous forensic skill and also great eloquence. I mean, this is the kind of case where, you know, a Clarence Darrow would glow. It would be made for an attorney like that. And you know, the United States has the most sophisticated and biggest constitutional law legal community in the world. There are such people in the United States. Definitely there are.
All right, let's get to some super chats, Alexander. We have some super chats in queue that have been waiting. Let's see. From Falvi Pollard, $5 super chat. Oracle, what is the latest on the new PM in the UK?
Can you say that again?
In the UK? What is the latest on the new Prime Minister in the UK?
Oh, the new Prime Minister. Well, we have a chaotic battle within the Conservative Party. I think there's now 12 candidates who've come forward. I mean, before long, we're going to there's even talk of changing the rules again to restrict the number of candidates because there's so many. My own personal view is that the thing is going very, very much in Boris Johnson's favor. There's this absolutely cockeyed case that somebody has brought against him about the lie he's supposed to have told during the referendum. I think that the Conservative Party membership and the Conservative MPs are so angry about this case, which is an absurd case, that it's probably actually won Boris Johnson even more support and even more attention. I still think this is Boris Johnson's leadership campaign to lose. And I personally think the chances are he will be the Prime Minister at the end of this process.
Okay, thank you for that super chat. Super chat from Scott, $20 super chat. Gentlemen, can you comment on Patriarch Bart's GOA appointment?
Can you say that again?
On Patriarch Bartholomew's.
Oh, Patriarch Bartholomew's, which appointment? Sorry.
GOA appointment.
No, I don't know. Story? I don't know. I'm not aware of that. But what I do know is that there's more and more criticisms of Bartholomew coming from around the Orthodox world. And there's apparently, based on the submission for an article that I've just seen, a major conflict within the Georgian church brewing over this, with apparently Bartholomew increasingly taking unilateral decisions, which more and more people within the Orthodox world are seeing as extremely unsatisfactory. Now, Goa, I presume this is the Indian state of Goa. Is it the Indian town?
Maybe the Indian state. I'm also thinking maybe this viewer means the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, Scott. So maybe if Scott can clarify that, we can help.
Yes, that might be.
And I know that Bartholomew has done a lot of reorganization.
He certainly has. He certainly has. What he's basically been doing is that he's been insisting on his right to appoint clerics there.
Yeah.
In ways that the Orthodox Church of Greece is extremely unhappy about, and he's doing that on the basis of the claim that these territories joined Greece only after the wars of the early 20th century, which led to northern Greece being united to Greece. So.
Scott says yes, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese.
Okay. Then, as I said, I have heard about this story, and it's a further example of Bartholomew trying to assert Constantinople not just as the first amongst equals amongst Orthodox bishoprics, but as a kind of, dare I say it, Orthodox papacy. Now, I think that will be completely unacceptable to all Orthodox people. And I think for Bartholomew to start taking these sort of steps in Greece will, I think, upset a lot of people in Greece, which is, of course, a country where Orthodox people have tended to be very sympathetic to the Patriarch of Constantinople. And I think also, given that the Patriarch of Constantinople is known to have very close connections to the Turkish authorities, it will also be seen by many people in Greece as Turkey using the Patriarchate of Constantinople to interfere in church appointments in Greece, which I think will be a very sensitive subject for many people in Greece.
Yeah, he seems to be overstepping a lot these days, Alexander, especially with what happened in Ukraine and the Russian Orthodox Church.
Which, by the way, if I
I'm
can
trying to figure out what's going through his head by doing all this. He's more like, instead of bringing the church together, it seems that he's trying to tear it apart.
Well, he is, and I mean, I should add, by the way, that his play in Ukraine has not gone well. Very few churches and parishes in Ukraine did break away. And of course, the Orthodox Church that he tried to the church, I should say, that he tried to create in Ukraine has now lost its primary backer, who was Poroshenko. It seems that Zelensky is far less interested in supporting the schismatic church. So it's increasingly looking as if this whole play in Ukraine has blown up in Bartholomew's face. But instead of, holding back, he seems to be pressing on.
Yeah, and he lost the largest Greek Orthodox church. That's the Russian Orthodox.
Oh, well, absolutely.
The largest Orthodox church. Yeah, he lost the Russian Orthodox. Just a huge blow.
Yes, which is of course severed all connections to him.
Yeah, that was a big mistake. Super chat from Sparky. Former NSA computer expert Bill Binney says that the fast download speed of the hack indicates it was an inside leak loaded onto a thumb drive. Bill Binney has said that, and he's actually shown the forensic evidence to prove his case that the hack was not a hack at all, but it was downloaded on a thumb drive. Of course, you have the unsolved case of Seth Rich as well, which plays into that narrative. What do you make of that?
Well, read Mueller's report. It's very interesting because Mueller is obviously aware of Bill Binney's analysis and investigations, and very strikingly, he doesn't refute them. What he does is, as he sets up this complicated scenario of GRU officers carrying out these hacks from long range and setting up Guccifer 2 and all the rest. But he doesn't actually say that it was, in fact, those GRU officers who provided the emails to WikiLeaks. And he admits that it's possible that WikiLeaks got those emails via a courier, and he even identifies that courier. Now, what Mueller does do, of course, is that he goes to great lengths to say that it wasn't Seth Rich. I mean, he criticizes Assange for claiming that it was Seth Rich, or for giving people the impression that it was Seth Rich. But what I've since discovered, and I just throw this out because, you know, I don't want to join up dots in a case where there's not been an investigation, but it seems that the US journalist who Mueller identifies as the contact, as the courier who brought these may have brought these emails to WikiLeaks, is someone who had previously been identified as I mean, a year before, been identified as having been in contact with Seth Rich. Now, I don't want to put, as I said, these pieces together yet. We need to have this looked at properly.
Mueller says that in the Mueller report?
Yeah, absolutely. It's in the report. As I said, you need to drill through that report very carefully.
The courier that delivered the documents, supposedly delivered
well, he doesn't say he did. He may have delivered the emails. You know, is the same person who had previously, a year before, been named as the person who was in touch with Seth Rich. Well, I mean, you know, you could put two together, and you could come up with
documents, but delivered a thumb drive instead.
Well, he could have delivered a thumb drive. I mean, it's entirely possible. I mean, I should make it clear. He doesn't say, when I say he delivered, he didn't say, I don't think he says documents. I think he says emails.
Emails.
And right. that would presumably be a thumb drive. So anyway, going back to the question, Mueller doesn't actually refute Bill Binney's findings. I haven't actually seen anybody who has. I haven't seen a single person come forward and say that Bill Binney's wrong, and that he's got his forensic data wrong, and that it could have been done, it had to be done this other way. I haven't seen a single person do that. They come up with they ignore him, exactly. They come up with all these elaborate alternative explanations, but I've never seen anybody actually address head on and refute what Bill Binney is saying. And I mean, you can draw the obvious conclusions from that.
Doesn't get more credible than Bill Binney, that's for sure. So,
well, it doesn't. I mean, you know, Bill Binney is the #1 expert in this field. He should know if anybody does.
Yeah. All right, let's take a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up here. Let's see, from Guitardis. What will Zelensky do about the Donbass, Alexander?
Well, it's a question of what he will do and what he says he will do and what he's thinking. And these are not all, unfortunately, the same thing. At the moment, what he seems to be saying is that he wants a ceasefire, a real ceasefire with the Donbass. And he's been going systematically through all the people who lead the Ukrainian intelligence agency, the SBU, and he's sacked most of them. And he's sacking people in charge of the military, and he sacked people who are in charge of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, which has been a deeply militaristic, pro-Maidanist entity, which basically orchestrated the war in the Donbass. But he still says that he doesn't want to talk directly to the people in the Donbass. He's been dithering about whether or not he wants to talk with the Russians. He says that he wants to have another meeting through this so-called Normandy format, which will bring together Merkel and Macron in order to face off against Putin. And he says he wants the sanctions against Russia to continue. So he's saying all sorts of things which are contradictory to each other. I think Zelensky understands that the thing that worries Ukrainians most is the deteriorating economic situation in Ukraine. And I think, by the way, that it's now widely acknowledged that contrary to the sort of success propaganda that Poroshenko was peddling, the economic situation in Ukraine is actually deteriorating. It's not improving, it's getting worse. I think Zelensky also understands that if he's going to turn that round, he has to come to some kind of reconciliation with the Russians. He's also well aware that the Russians are committed to stopping gas transit through Ukraine in January of 2020, unless he comes to some kind of a deal with them. And I think he also knows that the Russians have now stopped fuel deliveries to Ukraine. He's also under increasing pressure on the financial front, with his erstwhile patron, Kolomoisky, saying that Ukraine should default on its IMF loans, which is an astonishing thing. But I mean, it shows how bad the situation in Ukraine is. So I think Zelensky understands all of these things, but I think he doesn't feel strong enough to act on them. And of course, he's now had this very sinister warning from a group of so-called civil society groups, which are the same groups that basically orchestrated the Maidan coup in 2014, who warned him against crossing any red lines. Crossing any red lines means speaking to the Russians and speaking to the people in the Donbass. So I think he's stuck. And I'm afraid that a political leader who is stuck in the way that Zelensky seems to be is eventually going to drift back into these very hardline nationalist positions that Poroshenko was taking, and which failed for Poroshenko so completely. So I'm afraid I don't think we should have any very high expectations of this process.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Alexander. I think for Ukraine, there's a lot of skeletons in that closet, and we talked about one earlier in this segment. That's MH17, and
correct.
I think Zelensky's in a very, very difficult position. I don't know why he would have wanted to be president, to be quite honest.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I will say is, of course, he did win the presidency by an overwhelming margin. So it's not as if he decided to make a real break with what has been happening in Ukraine over the last 5 years, he wouldn't have public support to do it. The problem in Ukraine is that it never seems to matter in the end what happens in elections. It's who controls the streets in Kiev who ultimately has the power. And I don't think Zelensky is confident that he has that kind of power.
Yeah, and there's a lot of truths that if they get exposed, Alexander, like what really happened at Maidan, who was really behind it, what really happened with MH17. You know, outside of the people that control the streets, there's the people that are funding those people on the streets.
Well, indeed.
We have an idea what's going on, and our viewers understand what's going
on.
Absolutely.
And I would add another very bad sign is that he's restored Saakashvili, that's the former Georgian president. He's restored to Saakashvili's former Ukrainian citizenship, which Poroshenko had stripped Saakashvili of. Now, the reason that is a very bad sign is because there's been a widespread view, which is more than just a view, I mean, more than just a theory. There's a very great deal of circumstantial evidence behind it, that some of those shooters, some of those snipers during the Maidan protests were Georgians and were members of Saakashvili's entourage. So it looks as if, or at least it seems as if, Saakashvili might have had a role in that affair. And if Zelensky is restoring Saakashvili's citizenship to him, that suggests that he's not prepared to make a proper break.
Yeah, people should never forget that behind all of this, there was a lot of no good on the side of Obama, on the side of Biden, Joe Biden, Hunter Biden, John McCain. There was a lot of stuff going on in Ukraine, and a lot of money exchanging hands, and a lot of money from big institutions like the IMF and other institutions that was getting laundered and funneled into Ukraine right out the door. So, I mean, this is, if people really want to dig into it, I mean, there's a lot of ugly skeletons in that closet.
Absolutely right.
Zelensky's in a tough position.
Yes.
All right, Alexander, let's finish this out with tariffs. One of the users in the chat said something about, let me try to find it. I forgot the name, but he said that Trump is now going to be fighting May with Huawei, the Huawei
Yes.
tariff. I'm going to get slammed from the way I pronounce Huawei. I know.
Yeah,
I get it.
no, like I get slammed.
Yeah, I get it.
I pronounce Erdogan, and I can't do it. I can't pronounce his name properly, and I don't know how to. Right. I don't know how to pronounce this Chinese company's name properly either.
Well,
so there we go.
So you have this going on. You have the announcement from Trump today that he's going to be putting tariffs on products coming in from Mexico. This is big news.
Oh, it's huge news.
Terrible news for Mexico.
Terrible news for Mexico. It also, by the way, goes diametrically opposite the theories some people had about what he was planning with China, because a lot of people thought that what Trump was planning was that he would slap these tariffs on China, and that all those factories, those US factories in China, would relocate to Mexico. And now, if they were going to relocate to Mexico, they're not going to relocate to Mexico because they're going to be slapped with the same tariffs if they come from Mexico. I think what is happening, and I think this is very increasingly clear now, is that Donald Trump is instinctively a protectionist, and I think he is working steadily towards a protectionist economic policy. I think he feels that the United States has been taken huge advantage of by its various trade partners, by China, by Mexico, obviously, and of course, probably by Europe and Germany too. And I think that we are going to see a steady escalation of protectionist barriers and an end to the world of economic globalization and free trade, which had existed before. Now, can I just say, I mean, protectionism, in my opinion, is probably not a good thing overall, but there is an economic case for it. What I don't see is how you can have a protectionist, a reserve currency position for the dollar, and a protectionist United States hiding behind high tariff barriers at the core. I mean, if the US continues to go down this route of imposing tariffs, of raising tariffs, of taking these protectionist policies, then it seems to me that the days of the dollar as the world's reserve currency are going to end much sooner than anybody expected.
That's where you think this is heading to, huh?
I think so. I mean, I think that perhaps Donald Trump himself, I think he understands that, by the way. I don't think Donald Trump is an ignoramus on economics, but I think he says to himself, we are a huge, continental, largely self-sufficient economy, trading with the outside world in the way that we have been doing, essentially as part of a great geopolitical play during the Cold War and since, has hollowed out our industrial base. We're going to slap on barriers on everybody. We're going to rebuild our industries in our heartland. And if that means giving up on the dollar as the reserve currency, then so be it. Once we've rebuilt our industrial base, we won't need the dollar to have that role anymore. We will be back in a sense to the world as it existed before the Second World War, when the United States went by itself and, you know, used to do very well there. That was the time of its great economic industrialization and modernization, and when it first established itself as the world's biggest economy. Now, as I said, I personally don't think that this takes into account the huge changes that have happened in the world economy since then. But I mean, I'm not going to say that it is an argument, a concept that has no rational underpinnings behind it. I mean, it's one that people like Patrick Buchanan, who is admittedly not an economist, and Paul Craig Roberts, who is an economist, I mean, are sympathetic to. So we'll see.
Make America great again. Let's not forget his slogan.
Make America great again. Make America great again. And it seems to me that that seems to be very much the focus of his policies now. But I mean, I would say that if you're going to follow this policy through, you must accept the prospects of higher prices for certain goods in the United States. I mean, that at least for a period of time, until that American production comes zooming in, which probably it will, by the way. But I mean, but putting that aside, as I said, I don't see how that kind of economic future is compatible with the current world position of the dollar. It seems to me that the two are in diametric conflict with each other, and we're moving towards a world of economic blocks, with the United States forming a mighty economic bloc by itself behind these barriers, and the Eurasian states, China and Russia, doing so also. And it is not a coincidence, incidentally, that this week, completely unexpectedly, Xi Jinping, president of China, has out of the blue announced that he's coming to attend the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in St. Petersburg in Russia, where he will be meeting with Vladimir Putin. Those sort of visits by the Chinese leaders to Russia are worked out and announced months in advance. The fact that this one wasn't shows that this has been agreed upon at very short notice, and that it is happening in conditions of great urgency. And the fact that Xi Jinping is coming to Russia to attend an economic conference shows to me that this is very, very much part of the trade. The background to this is the trade war and the rising tariffs in the United States, with China now looking to protect its position in what is, I think, increasingly seen as its economic and natural resource hinterland, which is, of course, Russia.
All right, Alexander, a couple more questions and we'll finish it out. What will replace the dollar, Alexander? And have you seen the Chinese propaganda about the USA tariffs?
Yes, I have seen some
that have
of
been
it
floating around.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and may I just say something, by the way? I mean, we mustn't just think that this is the Chinese government that is angry about all of this. When I was in Shanghai in 2017, it was very, very obvious to me then that the Chinese business community were still very committed to good economic and commercial relations with the US, and that they weren't taking Donald Trump and what he was saying seriously at that time. And of course, now I think this has come as a shock, and I think they're horrified by what they're seeing the US do. And I think some of them feel very angry and perhaps even betrayed. And China, which is a very, very patriotic and nationalist place, like the US is, by the way, the Chinese people, ordinary Chinese people, are also very angry about it. So yes, I have seen some of this, some of what has been called propaganda. As I said, we mustn't think of all of this as simply coming from above. Some of it, I am pretty sure, is coming from below also.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, I think that, you know, Chinese people looking at this are very angry and feel that the United States is blaming China for its economic failures, which I don't think that people in China feel responsible for. And I think that there is a growth of anti-American feeling in China.
All right. And one last super chat from Blackjack Pinocchio. China is threatening to limit rare earth exports. That may trigger a worldwide economic downturn.
Well, I think
are rare earth exports, Alexander, really that rare?
Well, I question that, actually. And can I just say, I forgot to discuss, going back to the previous question, the question of what will take over as reserve currencies. But let me first of all discuss rare earths. I mean, they're not that rare, actually. I mean, they do exist in all sorts of places. Some of them exist within the territory of the United States itself. What the Chinese do, and the reason they have this hugely dominant position with rare earths, is, of course, they go through this very complex and expensive process of refining them. Now, it would take time for the United States to set up its alternatives, but I think it would do so. The countries which I suspect might be harder hit than this are countries like Germany. And it was very interesting that a couple of years ago, when it was first suggested that the Chinese might start restricting rare earth exports, the Germans and people like them were talking about developing them in Russia, which is, of course, another country which is fully capable of providing all the resources there. And of course, that really isn't an option because the Chinese are moving into Russia now in such a big way. So, I think that if the Chinese take this step, which would be a dramatic step, by the way, would be a huge thing if they did it. Yes, there would be, in the short term, a great deal of turbulence. But I think over time, the United States would be able to develop its own resources in these fields, and would be able to replace those rare earths that China is supplying. And if it couldn't replace specific items, specific earths, if you like, it would probably find alternatives. So one mustn't make the mistake of thinking that this will stop the whole progress of technology. But of course, it would be a problem. Now, going back to what would be the replacement world currency, there's been much discussion about this. There's been previous discussion that it would be the Chinese currency, the RMB. It faces the problem that it is not yet fully convertible, and it's not clear that the Chinese authorities want it to become so. And there's also been suggestions that it could be a basket of currencies, with some people even talking improbably about the euro. And of course, there's been talk about cryptocurrencies also. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that with the pattern of World Bank action, that the likeliest medium of international exchange, if the dollar ceases to be the reserve currency anytime soon, will again be gold. I mean, I can't see why else central banks should be stockpiling gold to the extent that they currently are. And it's not just the Russians, by the way, who are doing it. More and more countries are joining in doing it. And the very fact that the central banks are stockpiling gold in itself makes it more likely that they would go for gold if, as I said, the reserve currency status of the dollar became challenged anytime very soon. But this is still a very early stages in what I suspect is going to be a complex process, and we shall just have to wait and see how it shapes out.
All right, we will leave it at that. Alexander Mercouris in London, the Oracle of London. Thank you very much for this live stream. Thank you to everyone that sent us super chats. Thank you to everyone that sent us questions. And once again, we apologize for the late start. Thank you to Peter Lavelle, who couldn't join us because of YouTube's trickery. Hangouts, the games that Hangouts plays with us. But I think we'll have a live stream probably on Monday. We'll see if we announce it maybe a day in advance or Monday morning, but we'll try to do a live stream on Monday with all of us present. Guys, hit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt, buy a mug. T-shirt I got on, the mug that Alexander is holding in his hand. Alexander, you want to say a couple words?
The t-shirt I'm wearing, an excellent mug, despite what was said, fully worth its price. I mean, the reason it's got its price is because it is actually really high quality. I mean, this is a good, solid mug. As I said, I drink tea from it myself, but you know, you can drink coffee or beer or whatever else you like, or hot chocolate from it too. And as I said, the polo shirt I'm wearing, incredibly comfortable, 100% cotton, beautiful embroidery, very high quality, and anybody who buys it will both be helping us and will get themselves some quality goods.
Yeah, it is a magic bug, Alexander, because as you drink from it, you obtain a whole lot of geopolitical knowledge.
Very true. Very true. You can see it's also big, so it has to contain all that knowledge.
I think one of the questions in the chat was how did you get all this geopolitical knowledge, Alexander? And I think it is from drinking the mugs.
From the mugs, absolutely. I mean, this is where it all comes. So you want to reproduce the knowledge, you buy yourself a mug, and it will all come pouring out.
That's right. All right, guys. Thank you to everyone out there. We really appreciate your support. We hope you have a great weekend. Take care, everybody.